about Rousseau is that his operas are terrible. Well, they were popular then, I guess. He made money. That's kind of the big deal, right? So, Rossini, I think, made the most money from writing operas of any of the major operatic composers. It's pretty cool. Contemporary opera composer, instead of looking at Rousseau, it's Philip Glass. I mentioned him to Hunter the other day. And there's quite a few. Einstein on the Beach, Satyagraha, which is about Mahatma, Gandhi, however you say, yeah, whatever. Akhenaten is one that I play a lot for various reasons, but that's not the actual. But if you listen to the opera, you can listen to parts of it, of course, on the web. I don't know if you can listen to the whole thing or not. And of course, you have to suffer from so this has nothing to do with Rousseau or Kant. But if you think of operas as passé, obviously not. There's plenty of contemporary operas. I don't know if you would like them or not. There's one this weekend being performed that's brand new in the pack. I'm not sure if American Dream, I think it's called. I forget. I didn't buy tickets, so I wasn't planning on going. But it's about a Japanese person and a Jewish person who are both, I guess, interred in American confinement during World War II, if you're familiar with that whole thing. So that's interesting. But let me go and take a look at Rousseau. He's not one of my favorites. I think he was a first-class asshole.
Rousseau?
Pardon?
Rousseau was?
Rousseau, yeah, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And there's just so many things he did that just totally pissed me off about a person. You know that. Well, for one thing, the horror of the French Revolution is blamed on Rousseau because it was his version of the social contract. When we talked about Hobbes, we talked about the social contract being based on security. You know, the idea that in the imaginary natural world, the world before there was government, the state of nature, that it was a dog-eat-dog world. Everybody, you know, killing one another. You know, everybody had all the rights, but none of the rights. It was a useless concept because you could have whatever rights you wanted, but the other person would, he'd kill you for whatever you had. You know, no problem. So there's no real security. So, from that imaginary state of nature, Hobbes gives us a system of government that's a social contract. We all negotiate with one another for mutual benefit. And for Hobbes, the main benefit would be security, so that I wouldn't be killed by you while I was sleeping. Instead, there would be an authority that would kill you if you killed me while I was sleeping. That kind of, and it does work. Every once in a while, we know the police are out there killing somebody for killing somebody while they were sleeping. I just read about another one today. The guy running on the Steese Highway or whatever it was from the state troopers, and they shot him because he got out of the car and held a gun pointed in their direction. That it was the gun that he stole from the Walmart up there. It still had the lock on the trigger, and it had no firing pin. They still shot him, which, hey, it might have been another gun, who knows? In any case, that's one version of the social contract. Hobbes. Locke is the one that our Constitution theoretically is more solidly based on, because that was Jefferson's favorite, John Locke, and he was the one that came up with an imaginary state of nature that was a family. Everybody grows up in family life, and that actually makes a lot more sense. And mom loves you, you know, your father loves you, hopefully, you know, so you've got love and affection among everyone, but it gets too complex. There's not enough of a system for mom to keep everybody in order, and so they form a contract. But this kind of contract is one where there are checks and balances. So if you don't do what you're supposed to, you could be removed from office, even if you're the king. So, but remember, that reflected Locke's situation with William of Orange, who was, in fact, replacing James because they didn't like James anymore for lots of reasons. But even William was under contract. And ever since then, the British monarchy has been a constitutional monarchy, a limited monarchy, where the king's authority is limited by whatever the parliament assigns to itself, right? And then, of course, our social contract, we don't even have a king, we have a president, and thanks to Washington, theoretically, it never became a monarchy. You've probably heard those stories. But in any case, we ended up with three branches of government: the executive, the judiciary, which the others did not have, and the legislative, which makes the laws, etc. Notice our states are based on that too, so that's kind of interesting. Rousseau's social contract was a little bit different. Remember, Voltaire basically suggested to him, if he wants to be popular and sell books, what you have to do is write a book that says just the opposite of what everybody believes to be true. And that works, actually, still today, I think. In any case, his book on the social contract, The Social Contract, argues that in the state of nature, we are absolutely terrific. We get along with one another, we love one another. It's like heaven on earth. It's, you know, the woods are pristine, we're not destroying them, you know, everybody has plenty of everything. It's, you know, the perfect, gentle, native, you know, concept. Like that was used kind of in the Last of the Mohicans, if you're familiar with that book at all. You know, the natives are just so nice, you know, they never hurt anybody, you know, but along comes civilization, and civilization just corrupts the heck out of everybody. So the real evil in society is society. You see, it's just the opposite of what everyone would, you know, so instead of, you know, living in the state of nature, it's wild and everybody eats one another, you know, for lunch. Instead of that, that's the perfect heaven for us. That's where we're designed to be, basically. But boy, as soon as we start forming these social contracts, society corrupts us and creates corruption and power plays and private property and all that stuff. Just makes everything worse for everybody. So the best thing to do is to have as limited a government as possible. We've heard that one, right? And the laws have to be approved by everybody. So there's none of this representational stuff, none of the elite getting, the kind of an aristocratic privilege to choose the laws. Instead, everybody has to show up and vote. It's one person, one vote situation. And unless everybody votes for it, we can't have it. So basically, it's actually impossible to govern. So the French actually tried this, and it didn't work, and everybody got mad at one another. And of course, Robespierre, if you're familiar with him, ended up I don't know if he actually invented the guillotine, but that ended up being used a lot, if you're familiar with that, the Reign of Terror. And there's a picture of the guillotine. And you probably know Robespierre himself eventually had his head chopped off. So an awful lot of people were killed, even though they theoretically shouldn't have been, even by the principles that they were using in order to kill. So if they're going to kill all of the aristocracy, at least at the top. Notice the problem with that is there's no real clear borderline, and prior to that, you could become part of the aristocracy by being good at something. And that was, it was like an earned position, especially in the military and things of that sort. Notice that the British still award people medals. You could become a knight of whatever, the Garter or whatever, and be proudly carrying your initials even to the grave, of what the honors the royalty have given you, etc. So that's okay. Roger Scruton is funny because his father was a Whig and hated the aristocracy. The Whig was a particular party, right, that was against the aristocracy, and his father was against the aristocracy, but because of his own achievements, the Queen gave him a medal and inducted him into one of those own societies that was hard for him to accept, but on the other hand, he was proud of it. So Roger Scruton's funny the way he describes how his father both liked and hated the fact that he had received the award, but it was on his gravestone. So the social contract. So when we talk about social contract philosophers, we certainly talk about Rousseau as one of the big three. On the other hand, is absolutely a dismal failure, his version of it. By the way, the whole concept of the social contract is still very much with us. When you study law in the U.S., I've not actually gone to law school, of course, but if you do, my understanding, at least at the University of Chicago, there's 2 graduate level courses in law, both on John Rawls, who's a Harvard political philosopher, who uses social contract as the basis for the legitimate nature of our laws, that we the people, form this contract, etc. So that's the legitimating narrative of contemporary governments, although of course there's other ones like the Chinese government that doesn't accept that. They're communist. It's different. In a way, it's really much more just China than communist, but they clearly adopted, thanks to Mao Zedong and the Little Red Book. It was funny. I was at the veterinarian office in Eagle River that I take my animals to, not my kids, just the pets, right? And on this particular day that I was visiting, they had a sign announcing the birth of some kittens, and they were all excited, you know, and one of the kittens' name was Meow, you know, but it was written as Mao, as in Mao Zedong, and I said, oh, that's just like Chairman, because the cat's full name was Chairman Meow. You see, and that was Mao Zedong's title, right? He was Chairman Mao. So the cat's name, named by obviously the owners, was Chairman Meow. And the veterinarian clerk thought that was funny. And I said, yeah, just like Chairman Meow, Mao Zedong. And she looked at me like, what? She had no clue there was such a thing as Chairman Mao Zedong. So she thought the name was funny, but she didn't know why. So that's just, but yeah, if you're interested in the Chinese government, there's some really interesting stuff written on it. One of my favorites is by someone that a lot of people hate, and that's because his name is Kissinger. This keyboard is really weird today. As you may be familiar, Henry Kissinger was the Secretary of State for the Nixon administration. That was also Vietnam era, which is why an awful lot of people think he's a war criminal, etc. But nonetheless, he was also the one that negotiated with the Chinese and eventually set up the meeting between Nixon and China, which is considered Nixon's greatest accomplishment, because they ended up basically brokering a deal between China and the United States, so that we ended up kind of neatly balancing off the Soviet Union as you know, we caught them by surprise because of Nixon's visit to China, which was all set up by Kissinger. So if you're interested, this is a historical study of China, etc. By the way, Kissinger says he didn't know diddly squat about China before he went. So it's not like he was a China expert before he went and set things up. He learned a lot about China, obviously from doing that, but also as a scholar since. So he's not saying that he was a Chinese expert before he went. But still, this is, I think, a terrific example of that. Okay, so other books that Rousseau wrote. Emile, I think I've mentioned this. Emile is another example of where he describes what the best education is. And notice this was banned in Paris and publicly burned. So, you know, again, he became famous, you know, because when your book is banned, that's a surefire way of making sure everybody wants to read it, right? You know, that's same thing happened to Harry Potter. Remember when Harry Potter was first published in the U.S., a lot of people wanted to ban the book, and they had book burnings, which I thought, you know, in a capitalist society, that's absolutely silly to try to get rid of a book by going out and buying copies of it and burning them. Because, you know, that's like Doritos, you know, you eat as much as you want, they'll make more, right? You know, so it's not how that works, you know. In any case, he became famous. And what is the whole point of it? I don't know if you've had a chance to read it or not, but basically the best kind of education is just like the state of nature, right? We're absolutely perfect in nature until society comes in and screws you up, right? So education screws you up. The best thing to do is to leave kids alone, and if they have questions, they ask, and then you answer, right? So child-centeredness, right? You know, the education should be centered on the needs of the child. When the child naturally has inquired about something, then you do your best to explain it to the child, right? You know, so, Hunter?
So he wrote these just to be contrarian just to become popular? Or did he actually believe these things?
Well, they're so contrarian, I can't believe he actually believed them. I mean, I think for sure he became famous, and certainly a lot of scholars would actually believe that he believed this. That's not my fault, right? You know, in fact, when it comes down to reading the letters between Voltaire and Rousseau, I've spent some time reading some of those, and a lot of people think they really hated one another. Did I mention this? That they really hated one another because of the nasty things they say to one another. But I beat you with a stick for etc. But it's the kind of taunting between friends, the way I read it, right? You know, so if you look at it that way, these guys are, they're not huggable buddies, but they're nonetheless they're friends, right? And Rousseau clearly gets a lot of suggestions from Voltaire. Was quite if you look him up, he was quite a fiery, got in trouble with authorities. His works were pretty audacious, critical of authority as well. So he had a lot of trouble. So in a sense, he was doing the same sort of thing, but Rousseau, in responding to his idea, literally while Rousseau was still just an opera composer, he asked Voltaire in one of the letters, so how do I become famous? And Voltaire said, say just the opposite of what everybody believes, and you'll become famous.
So they were big jokers, pretty much, back then.
I think so. That's why, that's clearly not all of the answer, but at the same time, it's certainly, I think, a more valuable way of thinking about what they were writing than going in and believing this is what they honestly thought. That's me, Actually, it's not just me. There are others. I'm just repeating the kinds of things I read and stuff.
Well, because they still have their letters, right?
Well, the letters are on the internet.
Yeah.
You could just look them up.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I found them. Google has all that stuff in translation, so it's not like you. I'm pretty sure. Je parle français, but I don't remember reading them in French. I think it was in English somewhere. You can find. I'm sure that there's both. Although I might have had help from my French. I forget. It was a while ago. I've always felt that Rousseau was an asshole, and part of it was because of the way he treated children. He never married, as far as I know, but he had several girlfriends, and they became pregnant through his relationship with them, and he dropped them once they became pregnant. There was no help, offered no money to help them raise the children. He could care less, and frankly, I just find that appalling. One of the things he also talked about was, this is absolutely silly in retrospect, but nonetheless, he came up with a experiment to find out what human language was the most natural human language that we speak. He was absolutely convinced that French was the most natural language. And he thought that the way to prove that was to take a young child before it's learned to speak and stick it in a closet and keep it there until it's old enough to speak, and then let it out and see what language it speaks. And he thought for sure it would speak French. And it's just like, how could you even think that way? That's just horrible. So yeah, there are things that Rousseau has done that just strike me as, what an asshole, you know.
Yeah.
So you see, and one of the things I believe, and it's not just my idea, is that you value the philosophers that lead good lives. You know, the ones that had a good life and did things that you feel were honorable, etc. You know, those are the kinds of philosophers that you want to read about to find out, you know, what did they think that led them to do that. And Rousseau is the kind of person that I want to avoid doing everything he did. You know, that's just the way of it. The solitary wanderer is another. Reveries of a solitary walker. It's kind of a confessions of his own. So that's kind of a notebooks on his own life, etc. So Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, very interesting, amazingly famous because people are that way. When people tell you don't read him, that's the first thing you want to read. They're the ones that's just us. Pleasantly, I've bypassed him by 1 year so far. So I outlived him. So that's fun. Okay, so let me move on then to the next author that we have, and that's Immanuel Kant. By the way, Rousseau is influential. Hegel read him and enjoyed Rousseau. Not sure if Kant did, but Rousseau did have quite an influence on a lot of people, so it's kind of important to be familiar with him, even if you wonder if the people that were impressed by him were just totally gullible. And I suppose what really helped my interpretation of his philosophy was knowing and reading those letters that I did read between him and Voltaire. Okay, but Immanuel Kant, way more important. Today, at least academics are post-Kantian, so we basically will accept the progress that was made philosophically through Hume. So up to this point, the arguments that I've been kind of merging together between the continental rationalists like Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, and the British empiricists. I lump Hobbes in, obviously, but also Locke, Berkeley, and finally Hume, have led to a particular quandary that the skeptic Hume leaves us with. And one other thing I didn't mention when I was talking about Hume, I know I talked about basically from my notes, and I really should go to my notes to follow this up. Let me go, class notes. No, I want 9. Okay, so Immanuel Kant. Actually, let me go back to 8 as well. So David Hume talked about impressions, ideas. The ideas are derived from impressions. The idea of God is an extrapolation. Customs and habits of mind, association of ideas, resemblance, contiguity in time and place, cause and effect. Okay, so did talk about cause and effect. And So this is where I kind of left off, talking about there's no synthetic a priori, and as a result, metaphysics is impossible, and that skepticism is the result. Before I go back to that, though, to show how that blends into Kant, let me talk about this one other issue, and that is personal identity. That's a really big one. We all think of ourselves as a persistent self. Especially as modern individuals, we grow up believing that I'm Bill Jamison, etc. I have been all my life, etc. But where do I get the idea that I'm a persistent self? Because actually, empirically, it's pretty obvious that I am not the same person that was born August 19th, 1951. I look a lot different. My beard is white. At birth, my beard was very dark. No, I'm kidding. Right? I can actually go and look at myself thanks to the modern internet with all sorts of interesting... What? Oh, I guess I've never logged into this one. Do you want to see this? Is this something that's worth having patience for? Do I remember my own password? I did. How about that? Sure, why not? Oh, dang, that's going to be terrible. However, so photos. That's the easiest way to find photos, right? Wow. Trouble is, I've like totally burdened the internet with like all sorts of who goes to Carr's supermarket to take pictures of tomatoes?
You do?
I do. And other thing, what bananas? Ooh, what a beautiful picture. Notice that's a 360 picture too. Notice the camera I took. Sorry. So here's a picture of me with my grandpa. So you can see I'm not the same as I was then. That's pretty clear, right? So what gives, and this was me when I was, in my...
Younger?
Yeah. No, that's a Photoshop. I know you didn't see. You didn't see that one coming, right? Yeah, but that's clearly me playing with Photoshop. I did it sloppily enough so that anyone who really thought that was me wearing the outfit would know, no, that wasn't really me. Here's me and my cousin. This is me here. That's my cousin. Sorry about this. I'm mad at him still, but he shot himself when he was 65. Why on earth would you do that? I was the ring bearer at this wedding. That's I'm not in that picture, but this is me as Santa Claus. I got paid for that, but I think I was a terrible Santa. This is me with my dad and my grandfather and my oldest son, Billy. So there's 4 Bills right there in one picture. Always caused a hellacious problem. When my mom would say Bill, and all of us would either look or all of us would ignore her. It was like you couldn't win. And by the way, my son now he's married, and his wife's father's name is Bill. So when we're at events with both families, the same thing happens. That's just hilarious. Okay, but so you get the idea. We change over the years, And this is me at, I don't know if you could figure out which one is me. This is my mom. This is my cousin, the one that shot himself. This is me here. This is my next brother, my sister, and my youngest brother isn't there yet. So that's the New York World's Fair. That was, I don't remember what year that was. Okay, but so, was that an earthquake? The earthquake we had on November 30th changed me a lot, because now I'm very edgy all the time. And I haven't picked the books back up yet. They're still lying in weird piles all over the house. Why put them back up? They're just going to fall again the next, earthquake. Makes it really difficult to find them, though, when you're looking for a particular book. Okay, so personal identity. We refer to ourselves according to habits and customs. I'm accustomed to thinking of myself by my name, by my social security number. Can't just, when I'm filling out my taxes, tell the government, I know I theoretically made money last year, but I'm not the same person I was, so I shouldn't have to pay taxes for that guy. No, the government's not going to appreciate that argument because I'm still tagged by the same social security number, and you're not allowed to just change it and start out all over again, right? So we have these habits and customs. But there is no specific I that we can experience. Remember, the problem that Locke gives us is that we can't see the thing in itself. We only see what we experience, the phenomena, right? And that phenomena does not include my observing myself while I'm observing anything. In fact, it's logically impossible for you as the observer to observe yourself as the observer, right? You can't do that. And this is something that Berkeley touched on, but he didn't really go too far into it. But David Hume really launches into this and points out that you have no I that you can experience. You can't see yourself. And so what gives you the impression that there is a persistent self? You're remembering your previous experiences, right? But guess what? Remember his use of memory to point out that we are fallible when it comes to memory. So I might be totally wrong when I think that I'm the same self that experienced whatever yesterday. I might even be wrong thinking that I'm the same self that just started this conversation with you at 1 o'clock, right? Might not really have been. Maybe right now is all the time that ever existed, right? Now we have a lot of time problems, right? What is now, right? What is time? Remember, that's the most famous paragraph from St. Augustine in his Confessions. What is time, right? Etc. And even Einstein said that that was the best description of time he knew, Einstein on Augustine. So that's kind of frustrating. Again, what he's trying to do is criticize those metaphysicians, the philosophers that think they know for sure that I have a self or a soul. Remember Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Okay, so you are. But what about now? Are you the same self? You have no proof, Renee, that you're the same self that you were when you said that. So, even if you want to argue that there's a chain of selves that is your persistent self, you have no proof that that's the case. And we could always go back to that wonderful movie, The Matrix, that seems to have marvelously demonstrated all of this for us. Although even in The Matrix, if you remember, it's the same body in the same vat that is the self that's having those experiences, right? But Hume points out that we cannot have an objective experience. of the subject of our experience. So strictly speaking, we do not know the self that's having the experiences that we do. Although I love pointing out that Hume is not impractical, he's not criticizing practical living. That's not what's under question. But the metaphysics that philosophers think is guaranteed, is shown to be untenable and useless. So therefore you have to give up metaphysics. And this appears to be a winning argument, by the way. We actually, today, if we look up current arguments, we have Doug Hofstadter, who argues, I am a strange loop. Did I mention this book already? Notice the interesting picture on the cover, at least of this version of the book. He took this picture, he explains this in the book, he took this picture with his hand using a new video camera, a VHS video camera, linked up to the screen so that it somehow showed that same hand an infinite amount of times in the screen. You see how that kind of feedback loop occurred in the picture? So that picture is exactly the kind of I am a strange loop that he's talking about, right? What I think of as myself is instead my consciousness thinking about me, thinking about me, thinking about me, thinking about me, etc. But at each point in that, I'm a different self. In my physical reality, my brain state is not ever recursive to the point where it was before. It's always somewhat different. My neurons change, my memories change, and in fact my cells are replacing themselves constantly. By the way, when I was younger, I don't know really how many years ago this changed. We used to have this idea that you were only born with a certain number of brain cells, so don't smack your head up against another football player, etc., because you'll get brain damage and you can't replace those. Well, now we know that to a certain extent that's false, that we do have our cells in our brain replaced constantly. They come from the pineal gland, so that's kind of interesting, thinking about Descartes. What's amazing is your brain is, for the size of the cells that are coming from the pineal gland, like space. I mean, outer space, right? And, the neurons out there are like the stars out in outer space. And our cells leave the pineal gland and head out into the brain. And on the way, by the way, they change from the stem cell that they are originally to one of 4 different brain cell types, and somehow they know specifically which type of brain cell they need to become, and just as one of your cells is dying, that cell arrives in time to replace it and take it. This is absolutely amazing. It's not like there's roads or anything, they just head off into the brain and arrives just in the nick of time to fill in its place. Absolutely incredible stuff. And I don't know how they figured that out, but it's amazing. So our brains are updated. Somehow, though, fortunately, the memories are maintained. So that's kind of neat, too. But so, I am a strange loop. Another individual that's fascinating this way is Thomas Metzinger. Some of you are doing him, I think, as your term paper philosopher. And Thomas Metzinger's one book is titled Being Nobody. Being No One? Being No One. This is... What's the coup? Am I on the wrong guy? Sheesh. I was going to say, who put him in the Ku Klux Klan? That's totally... That's totally wrong.
Yes.
What?
You
Okay.
spelled his name wrong. It's Metzinger, not Metzger.
How do they do that? Let me get back. I'm
I could be
finding
wrong,
way
but
too many.
I'm pretty sure.
Thomas
Metzinger.
Metzing. Being no one. That's, I should have, sorry about that. Yeah, this is, so the self-model theory of subjectivity, right? And this is quite dense and is actually a whole bunch of different essays. Not all by Thomas Metzingers, or are they? I forget. In any case, there you've got the same issue that somehow we create this persona, which is Greek for a mask, that we think of as the self, that we think of as a persistent self. All kinds of interesting things come up here because it turns out that the kind of self you are is a cultural habit, and different cultures have different habits. So when we talk about the idea of the modern self that's caused so much trouble in the West, in so-called modern countries, remember that Pope John Paul II blamed Descartes for this selfish self that gives us the social contract and argues that we have rights and that society is there for us, and that leads us away from caring about society, caring about our children. Said, modern people, for example, will refuse to have children, and everything they're after is for their own selfish needs, etc. So John Paul II, in his book Memory, called this a culture of death. So severe criticism of Western culture. The alternative, by the way, was Harold Bloom, who in his book, I might have shown you that one, right? The Invention of the Human, Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human. Did I show you that one? I'll show you that. Harold Bloom, Shakespeare, Invention of the Human. This, it's not just about this, it's really his forte, his book on Shakespeare, who he, I think, taught Shakespeare in I forget which, I think it was Princeton as well as Columbia, I forget, but taught Shakespeare for like 50 years. So, because obviously he's pretty old. Not dead yet, as far as I know, but pretty close. So that's interesting. But in this book, he argues that it was Shakespeare. And I think I mentioned that it happened in a specific spot, and that's in Hamlet. And that the plays before Hamlet didn't show this, but the plays from Hamlet on do reflect you have actors literally thinking to themselves on stage. And so that's physically showing individuals self-reflecting in front of an audience. And I think I mentioned that Descartes would have been familiar with some of Shakespeare's work. So it might not have been Descartes that came up with the idea of the modern self. It might have been Shakespeare, and then it bled over. By the way, another way of looking at this is Charles Taylor. I think at least Sarah, I think, is Sarah here? I don't see. But Sarah is doing Charles Taylor, I think. And that's the sources of the self. This book is a magnificent history of the self, the concept of the self, all the way back to Plato and up. And it's incremental, step-by-step development. So I've kind of just been talking about the modern self, but there's 20 or 30 individual stages that lead to that change in European literature and history. And those are detailed in this book. So it's not just a boom, all of a sudden now you have a modern self. No, it's a little bit of influence here, a little bit of influence here, and gradually this thing evolves as it does. And by the way, of course, it's still continuing as we think about our contemporary selves and what we think of as ourself and so on. So this is absolutely fascinating, and Taylor delves into a lot of the literature, especially literature that at least I never had looked at. So it's quite interesting that he puts that all together. But by the way, that's not all he's done. He's another one of those that's still alive and writing, even though he's in his late 80s, I think. He won an award for the secular age. This one won, what was the name of the award? I forget the award this one won. I would have thought it said on here, but I don't see it. Began with a T. I forget the name of the award. In any case, obviously, the secular age is about us today and how thinking about ourselves the way we do places us culturally in this so-called secular age. By the way, Charles Taylor's Roman Catholic, so he's not especially fond of secularity either. Okay. So I briefly mentioned Hume on religion as well. And there's some notes I have on that. But let me get back to what triggers Kant. And Kant, in his in the selection we have in the text, which comes from the Prolegomenon. The first book after reading David Hume that he wrote was the first critique, and that was the critique of pure reason, or der reine Vernunft. Reine means pure or clean, so for example, if you're wanting to do laundry in Germany, you go to der Reinigung, the cleaners, right? Notice it's also the name of one of the major rivers, the Rhine, which is basically the pure river, right? And Vernunft is reason, the critique of pure reason. And this is part of the Enlightenment. And what is the Enlightenment? The actual article, what is enlightenment? We should find Kant. And this is an English translation of Kant's article, Was ist Aufklärung? Aufklärung is the German word that's translated into English as enlightenment. And literally, auf means not of, but Klärung is a clearing up, right? Klärung, clear. You could tell it sounds like that, right? So it's like, what is clearing up, right? And what essentially is talking about is getting rid of all this stupid stuff that we used to believe, clearing it up so that you're no longer misled, right? So So enlightenment is kind of clearing ourselves from all of that stuff. Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed non-age. I think of that as prior to our adulthood, right? Non-age is the inability to use one's own understanding without another's guidance. This non-age is self-imposed if its cause lies not in lack of understanding, but in indecision and lack of courage to use one's own mind without another's guidance. Dare to know, sapere aude, right? I don't know if any schools or anything use that as their motto. Have the courage to use your own understanding is therefore the motto of the Enlightenment. Laziness and cowardice are the reasons why such a large part of mankind gladly remain minors all their lives, long after nature has freed them from external guidance. They are the reasons why it is so easy for others to set themselves up as guardians. It is so comfortable to be a minor. If I have to have a book that thinks for me, a pastor who acts as my conscience, a physician who prescribes my diet, and so on, then I have no need to exert myself. I have no need to think, if only I can pay. Others will take care of that disagreeable business for me, etc. Right? So think for yourself, right? But of course, it's much more involved in that. This enlightenment requires nothing but freedom, and the most innocent of all that may be called freedom, freedom to make public use of one's reason in all matters. Now I hear the cry from all sides, do not argue, the officer says, do not argue, drill. The tax collector, do not argue, pay. The pastor, do not argue, believe, etc. On the other hand, the private use of reason may frequently be narrowly restricted without especially hindering the progress of enlightenment, etc. This is very short, actually, and of course a very important document. It sort of defines what the Enlightenment was, so to speak. All right. Man's emergence from his self-imposed non-edge, primarily in religious matters, because our rulers have no interest in playing the guardian to their subjects in the arts and sciences, above all, etc., etc. Okay, so, but what woke Kant up, he says in both the critique of pure reason and his now what happened was he produced that book, and even his friends who were academics and read the book could not make heads nor head, they couldn't figure it out, right? So they basically critiqued his critique and came to him and said, what are you talking about? And he realized he needed to clarify it in a way that people could understand it better. And so he wrote a book that basically means read this first. So it's called the Prolegomena, right? Read this first. And in the Prolegomena, which we have in the text, that's the selection we have. He argues, it was Hume, reading David Hume, that first woke me from my rationalist Wolffian slumbers. They don't often put Wolffian there, but it's part of the original. And Wolff was a rationalist philosopher who was a follower of Leibniz. So where did Kant get his philosophy? His teacher was Wolff, Christian Wolff, I believe it was, with an E on the end of it. I think. Let me check. By the way, I hope you check everything I say, because I'm old and I'm just obviously running on memory here. Oh gosh, I'm not finding, maybe it's Wolff without. Let me try. Christina. What? Sorry. No.
Right here.
No.
Is it there?
Here it is.
Yeah.
Shoo. So it's not another E, it's an F, another F. Well, I was close. So he was, notice the German, and I didn't do this, I didn't write this Wikipedia page. He's the philosopher between Leibniz and Kant. So my mind must be remembering some stuff correctly, etc. So there it goes. Okay, so that's where his philosophy originally came from. It was fairly late in his life when he read David Hume's work. Let's talk a little bit about him. He was a genius right from the beginning. Everyone figured that out somehow. I guess you could tell that from kids because they're annoying as heck, or whatever, right? In any case, he obviously found himself in school, lots of school. People wanted to pay for him to go to school because they knew he deserved to be there. But in college, he paid his way by being an expert in billiards. So he would go to the gambling hall and beat the crap out of people gambling for the money, and that's how he made his money in order to pay his way through college. So that's pretty cool. It also makes you think, well, he's probably somewhat autistic in the way, because that's the kind of skill, a mathematical skill I guess you can learn that way. There's also so this is what? No, that's an ad. Boy, they're sneaky. So this is a French movie. Sorry about that. I don't know if I could get subtitles. So you do. You can get subtitles. The Last Days of Immanuel Kant. So this is Kant. I'm trying to think. I need him to turn around to know for sure. Yes, that's Kant. So this is Kant walking in the woods, which he would do every single day. That guy with the umbrella on this beautiful sunny day is his butler, who would always be tasked to follow him along with an umbrella just in case it rained.
Yeah.
And of course, people knew that Kant was a philosopher, so he had some individuals that would. This is absolutely hilarious, and yet I believe the movie was made based on actual documents explaining how he was. So the reason it's funny is because, boy, he was a weird old guy. But you can, I mean, even the way he would drink coffee.
Is he?
Oh, he fell. That's the scene where he fell. And by the way, when he fell, he was like all by himself, just lying there for the longest time, because his butler wasn't with him that time for some reason. And all of his habits were like repeated exactly.
Yeah.
Everything exactly in its place. Everything, you know. So if I were to say then that gives us the impression that he was slightly autistic, I think there's lots of interesting reasons why that might be the case. He does everything exactly the same every day. Let's see if I can. But notice, he did live until he was 79, which is pretty darn respectable, especially back, if you're thinking, this is Königsberg, which was Prussia at the time. By the way, the town that was Königsberg is in Russia now. And the Russians are kind of up in the air over whether or not he's a hero or not. That's, I think, kind of odd, because if it wasn't for Kant, you wouldn't have had Hegel. If it wasn't for Hegel, you wouldn't have had Marx. And if it wasn't for Marx, you wouldn't have communism. So Kant ought to be, without doubt, a significant individual that they'd be proud to celebrate. But it's like they're split for some reason, because I suppose he's associated with the kind of education that is also associated with the elite capitalist, non-communist kind of. So it's very strange. But the birthplace, or at least one of the houses that he lived in, is still there. And it's a mess. And so actually the house is in that location, but it wasn't one of the actual houses he lived in, because that house long ago was, torn down. But there is a house in that place, and so there's been this argument back and forth. The government keeps saying that they're going to build a museum to Kant there, if you ever want to go visit. But so far, nothing, as far as I know.
Well, I thought they did.
Did they actually?
I thought they were doing they did like a funding program, and they were gonna rebuild it.
Yeah,
Yes,
I've heard that, but so far.
It's vandalized too much, so they have to, why don't we just?
Yeah, so, and then the other thing that I like showing are like the grave of a philosopher. And his grave was in a church that was bombed during World War II, and it's totally gone. So can't show his grave, it's lost, whatever. However, okay, so he's woken by, from his Wolffian rationalist slumbers by the work of David Hume. And it's specifically this problem with causality and with the argument about the synthetic a priori. So let me get into that a little bit more. Why is that so important? The synthetic a priori, Hume argues, and Kant explains it actually better than Hume in this text that we have, that is what Hume argues is absolutely essential to any metaphysics. So the question then for Kant is, can there be metaphysics? If Hume is right, it's totally done away with our ability to understand what the ground of existence is, why being is here, what being is. All that stuff is basically outside of our ability to observe it, because we're totally trapped within our own minds. So how do we get out of that? Can we? And so we end up with this this picture of the a priori, which means before, the a posteriori, which means after. The synthetic is new experience, right? So a new learning experience. And the analytic is the definition, or the old, the analysis that you could do just knowing which predicates go with what subjects, right? So essentially then when you're thinking in terms of Aristotle's square of opposition. I should have just typed traditional. But here's the traditional square of opposition. When we're looking at this, and we look at this statement, for example, every S is P, that's the universal affirmative. That's an analytic statement. Because in order for us to know that, you have to know all the members of the set S are also in the set P, right? You know, so all horses are animals, right? That's an analytic statement, right? Notice that no S is P, universal negative, is also an analytic statement, because notice that's basically the definition. The definition of a dog is that no dog is a cat, right? The definition of a horse is all horses are animals, right? So I can know that stuff by just analysis of the terms that I'm comparing, right? If I know what a horse is and I know what the definitions mean, then I can relate those two together. That's analytic reasoning, right? But some SSP is a synthetic statement. Particular affirmative, synthetic. That's giving me that camera is black, right? That exit sign is green, right? You know, that kind of thing. Some S is not P. That exit sign is not red. Actually, I'm surprised. You know, normally they have red exit signs. I don't know why these are green. Does that make sense? No? I don't know. But so those are particular statements or synthetic. So when I'm thinking in terms of the analytic or the synthetic, these are the two sets of things that I have. And then when I have a priori, that's information that I know before I have an experience. In fact, it's the kind of information that enables me to have that experience. There are interesting arguments that if you don't have the word for something, you won't recognize it. There's a really silly movie. I guess it's more of a serious movie, but what the bleep do we know? Have you ever seen it? Ever heard of it? No? Okay, so what the bleep do we know? What the Indian observing Columbus. Maybe I'll get. Oh, okay, perfect. Internet.
Fighting with my family is
Except for the commercial. Sorry about that.
It's a witty and heartfelt comedy.
Match patterns already exist within ourselves, conditioning. So, a wonderful story that I believe is true is that when the Indians, the Native American Indians on the Caribbean islands, saw Columbus's ships approaching, they couldn't see them at all because it was so unlike anything they'd ever seen before. They couldn't see it.
When Columbus's armada landed in the Caribbean, none of the natives were able to see the ships, even though they existed on the horizon. The reason that they never saw the ships was because they had no knowledge in their brains or no experience that clipper ships existed. So the shaman starts to notice that there's ripples out in the ocean, but he sees no ship, but he starts to wonder what's causing the effects. So every day he goes out and looks and looks and looks, and after a period of time, he's able to see the ships. And once he sees the ships, he tells everybody else that ships exist out there because everybody trusted and believed in him. They saw them also.
Is that weird or what? That seems unbelievable. And I've got to finish with a quiz question, I guess. So I might as well ask you, does that seem believable to you? That you don't see things unless you have the word for them?
The word or just the knowledge of that thing?
Well, if I'm thinking, okay, maybe I've never seen that device before. I'm used to use them, of course, but if you came in here for the first time and you saw that sitting there, I think you'd be aware that there's technical equipment in this room, even if it's not technical equipment that you're. So you have the word for technical equipment or object, etc. And I can't think of anything in the room that we wouldn't be seeing because we don't have the word for it. But suppose that there were something in the room that you don't have the concept for, would you be aware of it? That's a really difficult question to even set up. I mean, that's why that movie strikes me as an interesting example of that, because I guess there's historical records associated with the shaman, that, there's 3 ships. These are large craft, comparatively speaking. I mean, you look at a picture of like the Pinto and the size of it today, or the Pinta, or, right? I wouldn't get in that, even on a lake, it's so small. What the heck? They took off across the ocean on that. But wouldn't they have been able to see that? That just seems really, really weird. Something sitting there on the ocean. But I remember too in a book called The Whale and the Supercomputer. I don't know if you've heard of it. That's a book by Charles Woolforth. And Supercomputer by Charles Woolforth, where he's talking about the natives on the North Slope, the whalers, right? And the elders have thousands of years of experience, and the supercomputer is essentially their collective mind from that history of experience, right? So thanks to that, the whaling captains can look on the horizon and see whales out there and say, oh, there's some whales. But Charles, standing there next to the sea captain looking in that direction, couldn't see anything because he didn't have that kind of experience that enabled him to see what the captain was looking at. So that's another example where someone needs that cultural concept to be able to observe it. I don't know how many of those there would be, but remember that we argue over whether the Greeks could see other colors in the book through the language glass by Guy Deitcher. One of the chapters is about the Homeric poems. One of the British prime ministers, I can't remember which one, was a Greek scholar, and in reading and translating the Iliad, realized that the Greeks in those stories only had 3 colors: red, black, and white. And he wondered what the heck, and especially since they attributed those colors oddly to things that are totally not those colors. So like the wine dark sea is a famous line, and of course the sea is not wine dark, right? So what the heck is wrong with the Greeks, that they don't have more than 3 colors? I think there were occasional uses of yellow as a 4th color. But so they literally got into an argument, because this was after Darwin, where they were arguing whether or not the eyesight of human beings had evolved to be able to see more colors. than they did during the Greeks. That was the argument. That, did our eyesight evolve, right? Today, of course, looking at that same argument, we simply say, no, that's too short a time for something that's significant to have evolved differently. But the culture definitely didn't have more colors, at least not in the record. So the question, of course, is that today we've got lots more colors, etc. But notice that even when you look at different languages today, so one of the ones he points out is the Russian language. They have 2 colors for blue, main colors. And when you test a Russian, he can recognize those colors very quickly because he has those cultural concepts. When you ask, if I asked you to recognize it, it would be harder for you to recognize the difference. So there are differences in languages still today that enable certain individuals speaking one language to recognize things that their language prepares them to observe, compared to someone speaking a different language that doesn't have those concepts. So this gets, of course, in the whole point of through the language glass. Language is what structures the way you perceive the world. So if you don't have the concept for it, can you observe it? Fun question. You guys going to have a good weekend? Sorry about the cold. It's supposed to warm all the way up to 20 from what I understand.
Oh, wow.
Which means we might have snow.